Hello and welcome to the Wakbada Bassett Creek Oral History Podcast, where our guests discuss ways that they and other Indigenous peoples have lived, worked, and played in the Wakbada watershed for thousands of years. This project was created in Minnesota Makoche, or Minnesota, the traditional and contemporary homelands of the Dakota people. The project was co-led by Dr. Casey Keeler and Crystal Boyd, with support from community partners. More information is included at the end of this episode. On behalf of everyone who contributed to this project, thank you for tuning in.
All right, good morning. I am here today on July 7th with Sydney Beane for the Wakbada Bassett Creek Oral History Project. Good morning, Sid.
Good morning.
To kind of get things moving along, would you mind sharing with us when you came to the Bassett Creek area? What time frame, how old were you? And where did you arrive to?
Yeah, I arrived and actually ended up buying a home first in Minnetonka. And then my wife found a home in Plymouth before the 10 days were up. And she said, I want that one. So she's the boss when it comes to houses. And we had sold a house in California, so we pretty much could live anywhere. I mean, that's an exception for a native person, but I earned it over many years of hard work, traveling and working all over the country. So we ended up living in Plymouth, but we're uniquely right almost on the fringe of Minnetonka, Wayzata, St. Louis Park, Hopkins. They're all right, where all those things kind of come together.
Mm-hmm.
And yet we're, 10 minutes from downtown Minneapolis, in a completely wooded area. You wouldn't even know you were near any city. So you can live that way, in Minnesota yet. So we came here, as probably Kate told you, as our daughters who decided it was time for our family to move back to Minnesota. And of course, I was working for a national organization and the top Western leadership position in the United States, and I could pretty much decide where I would live as long as I'm near an airport. So I was able to move my office here, and that would have been in 2003. So we've been here now going on 19 years.
Mm-hmm.
So we've been here a while,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of probably the longest I've ever lived in any place now is here.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So, and, living in Plymouth, I recently met with the mayor, city manager, and department heads, and particularly the parks. And the only person that lived in Plymouth longer than me was the mayor, and he lived here 2 years longer. So when you talk about suburbs, there are not a lot of older people still out there,
Mm-hmm.
my age, involved in issues and working on projects, like this, where you're dealing with all the different facets and understanding all the pieces work and don't work,
Right.
and why people end up living where they end up living, or don't have any other choice in many cases.
Right. I feel like you are the only person I've ever met who bought a house and then within a 10-day window moved to a different house. I didn't even know that was a thing. It might not be anymore, but I'm glad you found the best place for yourself and your wife. And
I think we made the right decision. So this is where, Katie and Carly and Sydney, the three daughters that came with us from the Bay Area, lived and then went back to school.
Mm-hmm.
We're in the Twin Cities area.
So my next question is, what brought you and your family to this area? And it was to be with the family, with your daughters.
Yeah, well, we came with them. Our oldest daughter was already here, had married into the Prairie Island Indian community, and had the first grandchildren.
Mm-hmm.
And so I have four grandchildren who are members of the Prairie Island, Dakota community. And so it was a way to sort of, bring that part of our family, particularly the grandchildren and their parents and their grandparents together, and to come back to our Dakota homeland.
Yeah.
I mean, that really probably more than anything, because we were living in the Bay Area, and who wouldn't like to live if they could afford it in the Bay Area? It's an amazing place to live and to interact with and to experience. And we still have a son out there, but people always say, how could you leave San Francisco area? And I said, well, we thought we'd end up going back to Phoenix, but we ended up, in our Dakota homeland because it's our Dakota homeland.
Yeah. And now you have more grandbabies.
We just had our 13th. All of
Wow.
them, all of them born here in the Twin Cities area.
So exciting. Congratulations.
Yeah, so we're going to be around here for a long time, our family.
Yeah.
And there's going to be quite a few of us.
Yeah. So you have the 3 daughters and 1 son?
Yes.
So did any of your children attend school in the Twin Cities?
They attended college.
Okay.
College in the Twin Cities, University of Minnesota, Minnesota Community and Technical College, and Metropolitan State.
Okay.
Were the colleges. So it's our grandchildren, that have attended, all the way up, because we have some now that are out of high school.
Mm-hmm. When I was talking to Kate last week, we were talking about, where her children would go to school and the opportunities for Indian education programming. Are you familiar with the Indian education program in your school district, even though you don't have children there now?
Well, yeah, in Plymouth now that we do, yeah, Kate moving here, we will have children in the Plymouth school district, and I've already met with who was the head of diversity with the district, which, as I understand it, you lived in Anoka, which is the largest school district in the state, but the largest high school is of course in Wayzata School District, which is in Plymouth. So this is a good sized school district too, and of course Plymouth is a growing economically city that's getting to be right up there with the largest cities in the state.
Yeah. So I hope there's good opportunities for Indian education programming for the grandkids.
It's small, and we did have an initial meeting, and Kate probably told you, with some of the people. It's small. Diversity is really just now being driven by organizing in Plymouth. There is a growing neighborhood-based organization that I'm a member of and active with and working on, a Dakota-related project with right now. So our presence will be felt here.
Yeah. I joked with Kate, maybe in 10 years, we'll see a Dakota language school in the suburbs.
Yeah, well, that's not out of the question. I mean, in places like Arizona, a lot of the work is in Mesa and in the surrounding suburban. Although there's no real separation, from a native context between reservation, urban, and suburban. It's all the land and the water and our relationship to all of it. So it's a geographical, social, economic, politically driven concept of how people want to make money from land and water and all those things.
Yeah, so we can learn a lot in the Twin Cities from what other communities are doing with education in particular, outside of reservation areas, right?
Yeah, well, the Twin Cities, as you know too, is very unique in that it has the largest urban, geographically functioning within within, a couple of neighborhoods really visible urban community in any city in the United States. That was one of the things that interests me too about coming here. And I already knew most of the leadership and had worked with them nationally for many years. So it was not like me starting from scratch,
Did you live in the Twin Cities before 2003 at all?
No, I taught in Minnesota first when I got out of college. I went to college in North Dakota and South Dakota. My parents ended up working for boarding schools, both met in boarding school off of reservations, and then went back to work boarding school. So I grew up in actually also within boarding schools in North and South Dakota, and then went to community college in North Dakota in Wahpeton, North Dakota, which of course is a Dakota name. And I'm Wahpeton on part of my Dakota side, and also Bedewa-Contawan on the other side. So ended up going to Yankton College, and my dad is Yankton, born and raised on the Yankton Reservation, which was flooded by Garrison Dam. And so his land ended up being flooded, not by Garrison Dam, that's North Dakota, Pickstown Dam in South Dakota near Yankton. So my early history has been driven by, what happened to my parents being exiled, from Minnesota. And my relatives are on pretty much all the Dakota reservations. And now I have a lot of reservations on relatives on the Lakota, family-wise, I'm tied into all the different branches of the, what I call, really the mother group is Dakota. This is the mother homeland, and the rest came from here.
Right. So. Yeah. So when you arrived in the Twin Cities in 2003, did you know any other Native families at the time? And then maybe how has that shifted to the community families that you do know today?
Yeah, I knew quite a few. As I said, I knew the people who, pretty much most of the people who organized the American Indian movement, very close friends with, most of the top leadership, going back to their boarding school days and their relationship with my family in boarding schools, where their parents or grandparents were in boarding schools with my parents and grandparents. And, and then we, sort of ended up working together, particularly the people from the American Indian movement nationally. So I served on national boards with the leaders of AIM in the early 70s, and traveled extensively, also. I was the chair of the National and Lutheran Board that was organized by AIM out of Minneapolis, and then I was elected to be chairman of that board with the support of the American Indian movement. And we were the largest funder of American Indian organizing at one time across the country, because have in mind, there were no casinos, there was, Indian Self-Determination Act was, not really kicking in and getting the contracts, to the tribes. And so there's a lot of need for pressure, particularly on the Bureau and other institutions. And so there were not the programs that we have today, and foundations weren't funding. So the only real funding was coming from churches.
Wow.
And so I became I was trained in community organizing out of Chicago, where church-based organizing originated.
So interesting to think about that history.
At the same institute. I was the first Native person and one of the first person that went through the first long-term national training. And then it sort of guided my career by connecting me with the top labor organizers in the country, the top political organizers in the country when I was in my 20s, so I've benefited from a lot of things that happened to me, and it didn't happen to me. I've been programmed like all of us to be where we're at. When you get my age, you realize you stand on the shoulders of those that became before you.
Right.
And
And I think like
they've been making decisions with you all along the way.
right. As you mentioned, being the son of parents who experienced boarding school and exile, like this, this is what you were born to do, really.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
And then coming to Minnesota in the early 2000s to the birthplace of the American Indian movement, which you are already so heavily involved in. It sounds like it was a really good network for you. And
well, a lot of support, a lot
Mhm.
of respect and support. We didn't always agree with anything. I didn't cross over the line, that they did that led to the end of the national organization,
Mhm.
but I was involved in a lot of the demonstrations,
Right.
I believe very strongly in the importance of us having right to speak and the right to speak out and the right to demonstrate. I've
Right.
always believed strongly in that, and the Twin Cities sort of demonstrated that through the American Indian movement and national groups they were connected to. That so when we had days of action, I mean, we were able to take over BIA offices all over the country.
Mhm.
And I
Yeah.
led to take over the one in Chicago.
I'm
So
doing a little work here at the University of Wisconsin, looking at the history of the American Indian Studies program here, and I found a promotional flyer for an American Indian movement rally here in Madison, I think in 1974, and that was kind of fun. It says American Indian Movement, speaker Clyde Belcourt. So finding those kinds of records and what was going on in Madison in that time frame is exciting to see as well.
yeah, but Wisconsin was very much connected to it. I knew Ada Deer, just
Mhm.
after she also got out of graduate school, and she was leading the Menominee Restoration movement, and they were supported in organizing by the same group I was training and organizing with in Chicago. So they got some good organizing, behind that restoration movement, and that really
Yeah,
was a foundation for Ada Deer's, future, from settlement work to Commissioner of the Indian Affairs.
right. That's been one of the joys in being at the University of Wisconsin, is getting to know Ada Deer. She's such a great person.
Yeah, 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 very much so.
Yeah, but I think like you mentioned, you were born to do this work where your parents were, and now, myself and Kate and our generation, I think, are continuing that struggle. I'm more in the education realm, but it's all part of the same story. And we have these
Yes, it
great
is.
elders,
Yeah,
to learn
yeah,
from.
and it all starts with education.
Mhm.
I've been a lifelong educator, taught in colleges and universities, every place I've lived, made sure I was at least teaching one class. And here in Minneapolis, I was able to write 6 courses and create a new degree program at Minneapolis Community and Technical College
Mhm.
that ended up training a bunch of the people from Little Earth, who ended up, electing me chairman of the board of Little Earth. So,
Mhm.
and that goes on. And I've got hundreds of students out now that went through the degree program that I developed, including some of my own children who are out there moving
Right.
in the community, including on Metropolitan Council now. I have a former student, one of my first students, not Robert Lilligren, who was one of the first people that sort of took me through the political process here, and who I continue to interact with now more so, since I'm one of the founders of NACDI,
Mhm.
and he was chairman of the board. So very close relationship with still some of the leadership here.
Mhm.
Uh, that organizations that I helped develop, like American Indian CDC,
That must
and
be.
Migizi Communication. The national board I chaired, National Lutheran Board, gave its the first grant to Migizi Communication, the very first grant. And Roger Buffalo Head was at the University of Minnesota. Laura
Mhm.
Woodstock moved here from Washington, D.C., and Elaine Salinas, who was my neighbor growing up, in Wapaton. I knew all those people,
Mhm.
and knew them, some of them like Elaine from childhood,
Mhm.
and talk about somebody you should interview. If you haven't interviewed Elaine Salinas,
I haven't,
she's
but
amazing.
I did interview Eric Buffalo Head
Yeah.
for this
But
project.
Elaine, you talk about Indian education, I don't think there's anybody that's still around that knows as much as Elaine Salinas about Indian education.
Okay, I just jotted down her name.
She's from White Earth. Her maiden name is Martin. She has not only worked locally, and helped, in the development of MIGSI also, and then probably the closest friend, of the sort of founding. I guess Roger was very key to that whole beginning, but Elaine was a part of all that too. And then she ended up working nationally in education all over the country. So like me, she's got the local perspective and the national perspective and understands how it all fits together. And from the earliest days of Indian programming, particularly in cities, when I started out, none of these programs were here. There were Indian centers, and they were primarily social cultural.
Right.
And some of them maybe had some United Way money, but there weren't any of the programs, So I sort of understood and was a part of pretty much all of those different programs, in my work.
So why do you think the churches were such an early kind of pillar of financial support for a lot of the organizing and activism work of Native communities?
Yeah, I think there's two reasons. One, the churches really were historically the first place of organizing a community. You organize it around the church.
Even non-native, right?
I'm talking about the non-native. So if you're talking about urban, suburban, organized around the churches. So the early churches here actually were French, because the French were here first, in terms of the non-natives. And now it's hard to even see them, and they're like the Dakota people saying, how come we're so invisible, but there were all these Catholic churches and all these communities organized around the Catholic Church, and then in came, the English and Germans and Irish, and then Scandinavians, after that. So you've got the whole, and led by church-based organizing, really. And they had the resources, they had the relationships to the business community as well as to the service community. They were the first service organizations in communities, and the first then to serve also Native communities and provide services. Of course, the interest was to convert, and not very many Indian people converted, and still there are not many, if you look at it in larger context, that are involved, but the values are there. The mission is there that relates, to looking at how people should be treated, and that we're all, brothers and sisters, or we're all related. And the other is that Indian people experiencing the churches through boarding schools and the church board mission schools had this mixed sort of relationship to churches like to the federal government. It's kind of, I mean, in a dramatic sense, it's love-hate, love-hate. And so that comes into balance, it goes out of balance, but it creates a dynamic that brings those two together, and so Indian people came together around the values and interested in the theology, and also came together that found in challenging those groups a willingness to stick with the discussion, become educated, build a relationship, with those through those institutions. So, so that builds strong relationships. I often say, and Clyde would agree with me, although he wouldn't say in his speeches, without the churches, there wouldn't have been American Indian movement.
Mm,
Would not have happened.
right.
And so he always said to me, well, Sid, I gave my speech, but as you know, I didn't, say as much about the churches, but we know.
When I share with people the role of the Minneapolis St. Paul Archdiocese in the creation of Little Earth, people are always really surprised to learn that as well.
Yeah.
And that some nuns were even living there back in the
That's where the
day.
resources were, both politically and economically and socially, and so it was, and still are, churches are still community,
Shifting gears a little bit to think more about the Bassett Creek and the watershed. When you think about the Bassett Creek area, how do you relate to this region as a Native person, more specifically as a Dakota person?
Well, I relate to it, the relationship between the water and the land and the plants and the animals, and then the people, and the book that we have coming out on Charles Eastman really looks at it from that context, and that it was, it's really, looking at it from that context is really our biblical way of looking at things, put it in a church context. It's our biblical way of looking at things, how all these things are connected and related, and the interaction between all of them has been good and not so good, a continued struggle, to survive, So that's the way I look at it. I'm looking at the map right now of the watershed, which I made a copy of an amazing coloring book online, the Bassett, watershed coloring book. But I see it in terms of, first of all, the land, and then the water, which sustain life on the land, and then think of it in terms of the plants and animals, and then how people came and survived because of the land and the water, and still do survive because of the land and the water, and how important it is to preserve and maintain, in a environment of ongoing challenge, the land and water,
right,
and our survival.
Right. And how the land and water look so different today than it did 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 150 years ago.
Yeah, completely controlled, basically, by dams and projects that control it, dominate it, and so that piece is just part of the political economic reality. So our challenge is to, as Native people who don't see domination as the value, but cooperation as the value, and relationship as the value, to continue to find a way to build the relationship, but still protect, that which brought us and sustains us, the land, the air, and the water, etc. In a moving process and evolution of towards using up the water, polluting the water, same with the land, making it so expensive that, our families can't, by and large live increasingly in cities. Cities are becoming regentrified, with the new transportation networks, that have taken place of water. When water was, I look at it in terms of transportation. Water was the transportation. Our villages were along the water,
right,
and the water was our transportation from place to place,
right.
And so that's how I look at it. And then just what happened here,
Right.
and then understand what happened here and what's happening now, and what is my responsibility here, then understanding this. Well,
Right.
I feel I have a responsibility to the water, to the land, to my ancestors, that until I die, but it is continually pass that on to others.
Right. I feel like in many ways this is uncharted territory, pun not intended, in that we have to figure out how to remedy the damage we've done to the environment, to the land, and to the water. And thinking about transportation, what struck me when you were saying, the significance of water and transportation is, to my understanding, there weren't necessarily Dakota villages located along the watershed, but there were trails. We know that Dakota people, traverse this area. And then today, when we think about transportation and how easy it is to get from places like where you live, Plymouth, Minnetonka, to downtown Minneapolis, 394, right, almost runs parallel to the Bassett Creek watershed, which is like such a main thoroughfare in the Twin Cities.
Right. And it's the sort of the Gold Coast is coming out of Minneapolis this way west.
Yes. The Gold Coast of the Twin Cities.
Yeah, if you look at and follow 394, all the huge apartment places, the new West End, and and the increasing franchise stores.
Right. And I would say even larger scale, when I think about the West Metro, I think about places like Cargill and General Mills, right, that are located along that 394 corridor, that hold extreme wealth for the Twin Cities, but also nationally and globally.
That's right. Yeah.
So in contrast to thinking about Bassett Creek and Dakota homelands, have you thought about living in this area, which is Dakota homelands, and how it's become a suburb? Have you thought about your identity at all as a Native person living in a predominantly white community?
Well, I don't think of myself as suburban or urban. I think of myself as Dakota, first of all, and then I see myself related to first of all to my villages that were here. As you said, the villages were along the Mississippi and the Minnesota. And I have a relationship to all of those villages. Literally, family wise. Because those villages, as I understand it, Pinachon was sort of the old village, and then it went from there to, Black Dog, Little Crows, and then down, Shakopee, and then out, from there. So, I come from those early villages there, and directly descendant, from those families. So that's how I could see it first, and then they had villages there, but their villages, were not year round. They were not farming settlements, where they lived on the land and farmed the land and lived on the land year round. So really, the watershed and the water here is where they came out and camped. They camped along the watershed and Medicine Lake, St. Anthony Falls. Cloudman would, camps would move, because they moved in and out of the big woods, and out onto the prairie, depending on, what they were gathering or what they were hunting. So they were, to survive, they were also continually on the move.
Right. Right.
And so I look at it an area which they moved throughout.
Yeah. So are you involved in any cultural activities in the area? Do you participate in cultural activities in Minneapolis, in the urban Indian community, or do you return to your tribal community for cultural activities, or a mix of all three?
Yeah, I mean, I don't get back. I was born and raised on the Flanders Santee Sioux reservation. which my ancestors helped to organize as the first American Indian settlers in the United States under the, Settlement Act, and then ended up, in order to get their benefits from the treaties, they had to take on reservation status, and so that sort of took them away from the most freest life that, but the most treacherous life they had too, because they were doing it against the wishes. They formed a community against the wishes of the federal government, and so they were taking chances on survival, and the good graces of the people, non-native people who they built relationships with, and so growing up on a of course I grew up in a reservation, has a large boarding school, had a factory, had a farm. We had 100% on employment, between the Indian school and the farm, a huge farm and a factory. It was a garment factory.
Right.
At 100% employment until we became a reservation.
Right.
And then they took away the farm because it was part of the boarding school. And they said we're competing against, other big farms. They took away the garment factory, and they basically began to limit, what the school was doing, because it was originally an all trade school. So my parents ended up, coming out of boarding school with multiple trades, multiple skills, and where my dad went to work as a welder in Detroit during World War II, along with his brother. And my mother went on to college and ended up working in the health field, and so so I'm an exception in the sense that I grew up in a pretty stable family. My parents stayed together, throughout their whole lives. They worked, throughout their whole careers.
Right.
They didn't have easy time. They had issues like every family, health problems like every family. But I had the stability of community, family, and education. We couldn't go to the boarding school because the policy was if you lived, your parents worked at the boarding school at that time, you could not attend it. So actually, I grew up living in the boys' dormitory at Flanger.
Oh, wow.
Actually lived in the dormitory. And my dad had graduated from that boarding school and then went back and was the basketball and track cross country coach, and then started a woodworking program in the boarding school, amazing woodworking program, and was the boys' advisor and coach. So he got along well with everybody. So all of those boys who went through those schools have nothing but high respect for my dad, including, most of these guys from AIM who went to Flanger. We're talking about Charlie Deegan, we're talking about Dennis Bank and his brother, and Clyde didn't, but Floyd Westerman. So.
Wow. So lots of back and forth, lots of connections, understandably so, given the removal and exile of Dakota people between the Dakotas and the Twin Cities. Yeah. So Hahawakpadan is the Dakota name for Bassett Creek. What do you think about the role and importance of language and place names, particularly in predominantly white settler spaces?
I think it's critical to understand each other. We've obviously been forced, into an education system that wasn't ours. And as a result, we by and large pretty much all know English, but in the process, most of us have had our native language taken from us, through that same educational process. And so, so we still have a lot to learn about each other, And my sense is that because of the process we went through, we know more about our English speaking neighbors than they know about us. So, in order to really educate ourselves to each other and reconcile those things that have separated us, we've got to take on more of each other's understandings, and language, and is instrumental to it. Not that they need to learn the language, they need to learn the history, I would say, behind the language.
Right.
And the conceptualization of places and words. Of course, the Dakota language is completely scenic, so it's a geographical language, And so we have a common relationship to geography.
Right.
We can teach through our language in a place like the Twin Cities and this watershed an amazing understanding of the relationship between the land and the water and the animals and the plants, and how people's relationships to them are bound together by these stories that were here before we were. From those stories we learn who we are, or why we don't understand parts about who we are.
Right. Yeah, I think that's important, thinking about place names and languages, learning opportunities. So if we think about Bassett Creek, being named after Joel Bassett, and what does that mean? And I feel like that's pretty accessible for people that want to dig into it. But for non-native people wanting to learn Dakota names or the Dakota histories, it's not as accessible, because I think there's been deliberate attempts to hide that and erase it, right?
Yeah. And Judge Bassett, so it makes you wonder, well, what did Judge Bassett do in 1852? See, Flandreau is named after Charles Flandreau, without the E at the end. That was put on later, who came out here as a developer from the East, got involved with the state legislature, and at that time it was territorial government, so they were trying to buy up land throughout the whole territory, including along the Big Sioux River, and so he was a part of that early development, and then when it became a state, tried to bring that part into Minnesota, was unsuccessful in doing that. And that became part of South Dakota, but the name stuck. And then he ended up sort of leading the settlers against the Dakotas in the Dakota War. He was one of the main people taking on a leading officer role in the Battle of New Ulm. And sort of led the Battle of New Ulm, against the Dakota people, which was strategically may have been the most important battle of the Dakota War. So here I end up growing up on the Flandreau Santee Sioux Reservation. You look at that, and that's why I did a recent interview. I don't know if you saw it on Channel Fox, and where I talk about I'm such a my relationship to Minnesota is so complex, and such a contradiction that you have to understand both the complexity and the contradictions, to understand, even begin to understand what's going on.
Right.
So that's when I look at Judge Bassett, I think why this name?
Right.
Yeah, and of course, becoming a judge, he had the power, to determine, right and wrong, and at those people and issues that came before his court.
Mhm.
So they were the early power, power people along with the governor and
Right.
others.
Right.
They all work together. They all work together.
It's all part of the settler colonial system.
Yeah.
So this oral history project in particular grew out of the Valley Community Presbyterian Church's land acknowledgement process. What do you think about land acknowledgements in general? And after the work has been done to create a responsible land acknowledgement, what do you see as necessary and supplemental follow-up work to be done?
Well, it's a movement now, the land acknowledgement movement. I mean, the Arizona State University, where I graduated, when they have graduation now, first thing they do is make a land acknowledgement statement.
Mhm.
Arizona State University used to be the largest public university in the country. It's still one of the largest in the Pac-12. So it's certainly, there's a movement, and the movement is to really, everybody should understand, the people that inhabited this place and by which the names evolved.
Mhm.
And within the names, the stories and the history, because that begins to give you an understanding of why our ancestors lived there, what brought us there, because we've all been brought, that are alive today, we've been brought to this place. And like I say, we've been brought here.
Mhm.
And those who live after us, we are a part of, because, this gets you into physics, but, we're a part of a life that lives on. Atoms live on, and they interact, and they integrate, and when you really get down to it, everything is related. So that's why it's so crucial that we understand those relationships
Mhm.
in order to break down the barriers that have separated us
Right.
politically, economically, socially, and education and the theories of education that evolved out of that, driven by economics and politics, have defined our educational understanding and separated us from the land, the water, each other, and then made acceptable, the things that led to, separate us historically,
Mhm.
including shooting us, destroying, the water, destroying the land. And then the church, became complicit to that.
Mhm.
The church became complicit to that. Not always completely supporting it, being somebody who is close to the church. My great grandfather, John Eastman, was, became a Presbyterian minister, rose up to the highest you could at that time within the Presbyterian church and be a native person. And spent a lot of time in Washington, D.C., mentored his younger brother, Charles, through every step of his education and his career. And so, I have a close relationship to that history too. And there's a lot of good people, most people in churches are good people. The system itself is a
Mhm.
system that's been part of the overall system that
Right.
still has a ways to go to reconcile, itself with history.
Right.
And that means with the stories
Right.
that are connected to the history of
Right.
the people who were here first, who then it was okay to remove, it was
Mhm.
not okay.
And some churches are doing a better job than others with those histories.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And this movement and the movement to rescind the doctrine of discovery, which is another one, are important parts of that. And I know the Presbyterians, along with the Lutherans and the Methodists and others, have resolutions, that the doctrine of discovery should be repealed by the Catholic Church as a part of one of those movements,
Right.
that come out of our community, our native communities. And so these movements are growing, and that's why, so they're going to be around, they're going to be a part, they're moving into the educational realm and into the educational systems, they're moving into the governmental systems, and so it's part of not just reconciling with ourselves as separate beings, but reconciling with ourselves as one being, as human beings.
Right. Breaking down those barriers that you mentioned.
Yeah, all the barriers.
Right.
So I think it's a critical step.
Thinking about the environment now, what advice would you like to give to those who help manage and steward the Haha-Wakpadaan, Bassett Creek watershed and surrounding area today? Are there any particular changes or initiatives you'd like to see?
Well, I'm not as knowledgeable. I've been working a lot, with Minneapolis there for learning more about the Mississippi and the Minnesota rivers, and it's that coming from that relationship out, I guess, or not out. Now I shouldn't say out. There were, but that relationship, those connections, and again connecting back to the villages and then to the camps, and to the trails or paths, Chanku, the paths out and back and forth, and how these communities sort of emerged out of them and what they are now doing. Where I live now, I don't believe has a land acknowledgement statement, in Plymouth. But the group that I'm working with is one that wants to see that happen. The group I'm working with, the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Group, which is organizing across Plymouth, got a lot of help from the mayor and other people in Golden Valley, as I understand it. And so there's that relationship, and it probably relates to the watershed. And some of the people in the DEI, were probably, if they haven't run already for political office related to this, are running. They already have supporters.
Yeah.
That are connected to this whole thing,
right,
politically and economically. So there are more coming from Plymouth.
Right. It's interesting hearing you speak, the centrality of the watershed to this area, the West Metro, but that it takes the efforts of individual cities to do a lot of this work. Plymouth, Minnetonka, Golden Valley, Crystal, right? So that's like one way to think about the environment, or the geography in these really settler colonial terms, versus like the entirety of the watershed. It's interesting to think about that, for me at least.
Medicine Lake also. Medicine Lake is the biggest lake, within the watershed. I mean, people don't think of Medicine Lake as bigger than Damacoska. And it has a very. I'm working with. What I have found the best historians, who have grown up and live around Medicine Lake right now too, on a project, and they're working with me on the project we're doing in Plymouth. So we're already starting to work together through historical, societies and parks. All these groups who have a natural affinity to the story.
Right.
And to the broader story.
Right.
Are coming together.
Right.
You mentioned Hennepin County Historical Society.
Mhm.
What they have, what I understand, is an amazing archive.
Mhm.
And so archives related to Medicine Lake, early archives would be at the Hennepin County Historical Society. And
And
so
that's
that's,
where these records will go to for the oral history. We'll be going to
yeah, yeah. And that's part of my interest in this project,
Mhm.
because I'm working with Medicine Lake and we're looking up some archival information on early Medicine Lake and the mounds and bodies that were removed and what happened to them. And the archives go back to the Hennepin County Historical Society.
I think it would be great to see like more of a collaborative effort across the Bassett Creek watershed. So what's happening in Plymouth to also be happening in the other communities as well, with dialogue.
Yeah, yeah, and that's one thing. Having worked with the Minnesota Historic Society for a number of years, the first one I started working with, obviously, through Kate and I getting involved there, and then I've been working with them now for over 15 years. And so I've got a lot of relationships there, a lot of connections there. I'm not always agreeing, but continuing, to work on things. And now, having the Dakota Community Council and being able to bring in a lot of other families to work on some of those issues from outside of Minnesota, which is very important, to because most of us are exiles. Most of the vast majority, only a small percentage were not exiled,
Right.
and so most of us, are still struggling to return, and return the history of our families here, and return the history of
Access land.
our villages
Right.
that are least understood. They're name of utility companies and roads, but people don't know the villages pretty much at all, generally.
Yeah.
So we have a lot of work to do. In my case, my children and grandchildren, are going to be around here much longer, and so I realize now I don't have to get involved in everything. I don't have to, try to take, overall responsibility for things. There are many of those others. That's a learning pro. What I've learned, by taking responsibility, you learn more than anybody else. So I've done a lot of learning by taking a lot of responsibility throughout my careers and work I've done all over the country, mainly in and out of cities, So I understand cities very, very well. Now, I moved to Phoenix before there were crosstown freeways, and where Phoenix was literally a small town, so I understand. I lived in Chicago. I worked out of New York. My wife and I met in New York City. I've lived and worked in Los Angeles, over many years. So, and I've worked with mayors, I've worked with governors, I've worked with members of Congress, I've worked with members of the cabinet, testified, commissions and Congress. So I've tried to understand the system,
Right.
as it works from the bottom up and from the top down,
Right.
and interact with it at all the different levels. And fortunate, I had an organization called the Center for Community Change that recruited me early on in my career through a Robert Kennedy Fellowship, and then brought me on their board, mentored me through my whole career, literally, and provided me with the resources to be able to go in and do the work I've done, locally and nationally, throughout the United States, throughout my whole career, and so, in that regard, I have a responsibility to share those stories and to help in any way I can, as I'm saying to you, in any way that I can, and I know Kate will, to help with anything we get involved with. And we see the relationship between this and everything I'm working on. If there was
Right.
not a relationship to everything else I'm working on, I would not be able to spend the time,
Mhm.
helping, But again, I'm not going to be the organizer. I'm not going to be the leader. I'm not going to chair a board. But I have a lot of knowledge historically
Right.
about how the politics, the economics, the social side of it, educational systems,
Mhm.
how they work and what the challenges are. And there still are many. There are
Right.
increasing ones.
And
Because
new
we're facing
different ones.
growing separation, growing disparities.
Right.
It's like it's all starting over again.
Right. I think like the economic disparities are something that are becoming just like so enormous these days.
Yeah, like can't afford to buy a house.
In homelands. Right.
Exactly. And with regentrification of, which is a battle going on right now in downtown Minneapolis and along the Mississippi, and of course with the light rail, more people moving in, with resources and high-rise apartments everywhere,
Mhm. Alongside a growing
Indian
homeless
people are going to be
population.
less and less able to live there
Right.
financially.
Right.
And I saw that happen in San Francisco. I worked on the only Indian-owned building in San Francisco today. Is Friendship House. It's an alcohol treatment program in the Mission District. And I worked on helping get the resources and bring in the development team from the Center for Change, where I was working, and worked with Willie Brown, who was then mayor of San Francisco, to get the support to build Friendship House, which is the only, Indian Center burned down before Alcatraz. And I was there a week before at a national meeting, at the San Francisco Indian Center when that happened. And now Friendship House is the only Indian-owned organizational building in San Francisco.
Mhm. Wow.
Yeah. And then you got Oakland, same thing, Indian Health Board, which I chaired, is the one developing property in Oakland, and most of the people who we know who lived in Oakland when we lived there now are gone.
Mhm.
They're either Walnut Creek out west that way or San Leandro down that way, They aren't as much moving north because all the fires going on up there. But they can't afford to live in Oakland.
Mhm.
Years ago, they couldn't afford to live in San Francisco.
Right.
I worked in San Francisco. I couldn't afford to live there. I was fortunate at that time to buy a home, in El Cerrito, which is adjacent to Berkeley. But I couldn't afford to buy that home today.
Oh,
I
yeah.
could not afford to buy that home today.
Mhm. And you almost see that slowly unfolding in Minneapolis. The cost
It's
of living.
happening. It's
Mhm.
happening big time in Minneapolis. Big
Right.
time.
Well, in closing, is there anything you would like to share with future generations of Native people living in these communities outside of the outside of the urban area?
Well, I think it's critical to understand the issues relating to the land and the water and the air. That's the third thing. Understand the air, the water, and the land, and the issues related to them, the stories related to them, the politics and the economics related to them, to understand, how power and influence work, how separation is related to all of this, and how what a struggle it is for all of us again, to just have the basic necessities related to clean water, accessible land, food, all those things, energy. Again, those are all becoming scarcity.
Right. And
Scarcity in all those areas, and will be for the foreseeable future.
right. And
That's
I would say, and then also our responsibility to the land, air, and water, right?
that's right. Yeah, and it used to be, I used to say, so this power has shifted. And what I mean, it's still there, but it's shifted to the airwaves.
Mhm.
So understand, our relationship to the air, and our stories in relationship to the sky as well. Because the institutions like the FCC and the media companies, they're all involved in all of this as well.
I think that's becoming increasingly apparent too in our
And our
political
stories
system.
are controlled by the airwaves now because of the internet.
Mhm.
This is where the storytelling center has moved. It's moved to the internet, and it's moved to the airwaves. So if you don't understand the airwaves and why it's important to have network neutrality, and access,
Mhm.
and be able to get your stories out,
Mhm.
and the importance of getting your stories out on a regular basis, which is what I do.
Mhm.
Short videos, projects that are related to doing videos,
Mhm.
getting your stories in print, in books, on the airwaves. That's what I'm doing now. And because it says my age and I have all these stories, it's accessible to me.
Right.
It's accessible to me.
Right. And especially
So
during this new age of COVID, um,
yeah,
it's become
exactly.
increasingly important to use the internet for storytelling and capturing and keeping these stories.
Yeah. It's allowed somebody like myself who can't get around as much anymore, just continue to do what I do.
Mhm.
Literally every day, I'm able to do that. So
Sounds like you need a TikTok.
I have a son that has all of that.
I've never even like done a TikTok. I don't know anything about it, but I know that they're like short videos, right?
My son has his own internet network called Johnny Beane TV. His main format is YouTube, but he's on everything,
I'll have to look
literally.
him up.
And he's been building that for over 15 years. And it's all around music. I mean,
Okay.
his form of who he was from the very beginning and how he expressed himself has always been around music.
Mhm.
And so he's found the place where he can do that all the time, 24 hours a day if he wants,
Yeah.
and make a living doing it,
Yeah. Is there anything else that you would like to share that we have not had an opportunity to touch on?
No, just that I'm excited that you're doing this project, and sort of as an elder, no project is less important than any other project.
Mhm.
This is an important project. It is important that you continue to build, continue to develop, continue to relate, continue to tell the stories, pass on the stories, relate the stories to other related stories. That's your responsibility.
Mhm.
And all those of us who have been fortunate to come into relationship with you. And I will certainly do that in terms of what I'm doing, particularly in Plymouth and Medicine Lake, and Bloomington and Wayzata, where I am. Minneapolis. I mean, I'm still doing things there
Mhm.
too.
Right.
So
Right.
you
I'm
can
just
count
so
on me
excited.
as a friend, as a relative, and somebody who pass on,
Mhm.
whatever I can help with, and we'll continue to work on. Like I told you, we are changing the name of County Road 47, Hennepin, the the county has turned over to Plymouth the right to change the name of that road, and it's already been decided by the Plymouth City Council that it will be a Dakota name. So
Very exciting.
now we're doing the
Congratulations.
research, and I have researchers from the historical societies working on all of that, because we have a scenic language to geographically plants, animals, go back and figure out what would be proper. And then, of course, it'll have to reach some kind of consensus, but it'll be a consensus among the city council at some point. But
Well,
it's going to happen.
That is very exciting.
Yeah.
I am so thankful for your time and appreciative of you sharing your stories. I think it's just so exciting to hear people's connection to land and how they ended up in these communities. And so much of it was about coming home, for your family in particular, and where you could have access, and now seeing your future generations, or your children and grandchildren kind of experiencing the same struggles about access to land, in a different way than you did and previous generations did. So important.
Yeah. Well,
All
thank
right.
you.
Naya chop na becha wopira tanka unkeni chiapi. Thank you for listening. This project may serve as a model for other communities that seek to go beyond land acknowledgement. To learn more about this oral history project, please contact Hennepin History Museum. The project was produced following the standards and principles of the Oral History Association. In addition to this podcast, the interview recordings, transcripts, and narrator files included signed legal released agreements can be found at the Hennepin History Museum. Funding and other support was provided by the St. Anthony's Falls Heritage Board, Hennepin History Museum, Valley Community Presbyterian Church, and the University of Wisconsin. This publication was also made possible in part by the people of Minnesota through a grant funded by an appropriation to the Minnesota Historical Society from the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. Any views, findings, opinions, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this publication are those of the authors and do not necessarily represent those of the state of Minnesota, the Minnesota Historical Society, or the Minnesota Historic Resources Advisory Committee. Anaya chopta pecha wopira unkeni chiapi. Thank you for listening.